Herzlich willkommen zu unserer Buchpräsentation mit Diskussion. Wir haben die große Freude, Clara Mattei zu Gast zu haben bei uns. Und weil Clara Mattei kein Deutsch spricht, und diese Veranstaltung auf Englisch ist, werde ich jetzt auch switchen to English. Warm welcome to tonight's book presentation, Does Austerity Pave the Way to Fascism? Based on Clara's book, The Capital Order, which was just now republished in German, translated and published to German. You can purchase it tonight here at the price of 22 euros. So please do that because it's a wonderful translation. It's a wonderful book that's been out for a while now, but now we have the chance to read it in German as well. Tonight's event is a cooperation event of several organizations that I just want to briefly introduce to you. First of all, the event is sponsored and supported by the Austrian Chamber of Labor, Arbeiterkammer Wien, bei BeiGewum, der Beirat für Gesellschafts-, Wirtschafts- und Umweltpolitische Alternativen. We're a small association of critical social scientists celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, and we also published the journal Kurswechsel. I'll have a BeiGewum newsletter list that I'll give around here. If anyone is interested in events like these, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter. Then, of course, Jaco and Buchpremiere Verlag, which published the book in German now, Transform Europe, which is the foundation of the European Left Party, was gracious enough to house us here at their offices here in Vienna. Attac Austria, who celebrate their 25th anniversary this year, and they will have a big birthday festival from June 19th to 21st, and you can register for that soon on the Attac website, so please do that. Tonight's event will also be recorded, at least the input part, so we'll cut it off before the Q&A session starts. So just, this camera is only pointing on stage, so no need to be afraid that you will be on camera. We will just film ourselves on here. All right, that's it for the organizational part. Content-wise, what we thought would be good for tonight is to start off with an input by Clara on the main thesis of her book, both what current austerity politics looks like, but then also her very thorough historical investigation of austerity politics in Italy and England. And we will then move on to a comment from my side on historical austerity politics in Austria in the 1920s. And we will end up back in the present to discuss current budgetary politics, not only in Austria, but also the European Union or worldwide, and we'll see where that leaves us. And then we will have enough time for Q&A. Clara Mattei is professor of economics at the University of Tulsa, where she also recently founded the CHE, the Center of Heterodox Economics, one of the few heterodox institutes in economics in the US. I'm sure you'll give us a few words on how that institution came along. The Order of Capital also won several prizes, and we're so happy to have you here. And with this, I give over to you, maybe to introduce us to CHE a little bit more, and then also why this book is called Capital Order and what you were thinking about when writing it.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And it's also really lovely to see so many young faces. It's a real pleasure. Well, I would start by saying that as critical or heterodox economists, our first words, of course, go to our cognizance and constant awareness of the fact that while we're here discussing the massacre of the Palestinian people has started up again for a full week now. You have over 800 people who have already died since last Tuesday. Most of them are children. And that the complete devastation of life in all of its forms, the blowing up, just this week, 2 hospitals have been blown up with the patients in the hospital beds dying. We have the destruction, the complete scholasticide, the obliteration of schools, and of course the killing of UN workers. Now we've reached 284, I believe. It could be higher because last time I checked was a couple of days ago. So the starvation of over 1 million children that now are deeply malnourished. This phenomenon that we're seeing in front of our eyes, while basically our establishment is silent and actually supports, is not a separable problem from our economic system. What we need to realize is that massacring people is actually profitable for our economy and is a stimulus for our economy. We see that indeed the value on the market value of the major corporations, directly, of course, related to the military, like Lockheed Martin or RTX, have risen to 50 or 75% since October 7th of 2023. And a year and a half later, indeed, there is a huge economic boom in many corporations that are connected deeply to this massacre. So it is very important for us to avoid the compartmentalization that is so dominant in how we look at the world. And this is, I think, really what critical thinking is about. It's about wearing a lens, actually like adopting a lens that allows us to think deeper about social issues, connecting it to the drivers of our economy. And fundamentally, are you hear me all right? And ultimately, what is happening now in Gaza is really a mirror of a deeper truth, which is the ultimate contradiction between the logic of need and the logic of profit. And this is something that has to be said out loud, because I do think right now many people are feeling it on their own skins, even in a privileged place like Austria. There is a clear sense by which our economic system is showing all of its signs of unsustainability, of human unsustainability. And we need to confront it with knowledge that is actually empowering. And I do think that what is sad, but at the same time, I hope, at least I'm proud of offering, is a lens on austerity, which is such a fundamental tool of preservation of consensus for our economic system through a historical reconstruction. I do think that the historical reconstruction of this book offers insights that are very relevant to understand very present-day economics. And of course, the fact that, for example, the rearmament of Europe, and the fact that, for example, Joe Biden beat the record of how much the United States spends on the military, reached $916 billion. This subsidizing of the state to the private military industrial complex is completely in line with the logic of austerity. So this is very important, is that now the conversation is, Europe is rearming. There's also a sense by which you can even all of a sudden get rid of the deficit rules to rearm. This must be something different from austerity. No. What you see, and in the historical work, is that the definition of austerity that we normally use is a definition that is blinding us to what austerity is really about. Austerity is not, as you read everywhere, budget cuts and tax increases. This definition is empty. Why is it empty? Because it doesn't really tell you who wins and who loses. It doesn't really tell you where the resources are actually channeled towards. And what you find out is that historically, austerity has nothing to do with the state stepping back, retrieving, to leave the supposed market that is so spontaneous on its own to flourish. It's quite the opposite. What this story tells you is that the market, to even exist, has to be founded upon a political order, what I call the capital order. And this is an intuition that, of course, is developed by Marx. And the whole point of critique of political economy in his work is to say capital as money, as GDP growth, as wealth, is based on a social relation, which is a political relation. And it's a relation that presupposes that the majority of people globally has no other option but to go work for a wage in order to make a living. This market dependence that connects us to the fact that we are subordinated to exploitation. And when I say exploitation, I don't mean just bad jobs and, evil bosses. What I mean is the structural fact that we lose agency in deciding what is being produced and how once we sign the labor contract and we go work for someone else. And that the value we produce is much more than what we get in our paychecks, okay? And I think actually, again, to make sure that we understand how this wage relation that is so foundational to our economy has nothing to do with how much you make. It isn't really, I think, emblematic to think about the Google engineers in New York, for example, that last year decided they didn't want to comply with Google selling to the Israeli military a bunch of fundamental AI that was used to target Palestinian civilians. And their option there was either to get fired or to resign. They could not change the decisions that were being made by non-workers in how and what the corporation was producing, all right? So this fundamental capital order has nothing spontaneous to it. And this is something that history emancipates us from. The eternality of capitalism is mere fiction. It's a fiction that helps a lot, but it's really, really profoundly historically problematic. What you find out is that the capital order has to actually be constantly safeguarded and protected. And this is what austerity does. Austerity does not balance the budget, does not secure financial prudence. What it does is secure the wage relation, secure private command over investment, secure the capital order. And this is really important because it is a change of perspective from how the debate on austerity usually happens. Austerity, and that's why I actually started this research in the first place. I started this research a long time ago, in 2013. It's a long time ago. When I was doing my PhD and I was living in Italy and Mario Monti was in power and, we were going through a good dosage of austerity. And the debate in economics was so dry. It was all about whether austerity was delivering on or not on its promise of balancing the budget and potentially having the economy grow, right? And so we had the expansionary austerity, a theory that tells you that, of course, supply-side economics helps boost the economy and thus resolve the deficit problem. And those Keynesians who told you, no, it never works. And historically, there's so many examples that show how actually applying austerity has driven countries to further dependence on foreign markets and ultimately further debt traps, all right? So in this debate, there was no discussion of what ultimately is the most important element of the conversation, which is that the economy is not just a machine that you regulate like an external object, like the economy is us. Again, based on political relations that are not at all obvious and stable. And what you find out, actually, the story I tell is if you look at one of the moments in which austerity emerges very explicitly, it emerges exactly to counteract possible alternatives to capitalism. And so the thesis here is that austerity is not just bad policy, like the Keynesian would tell you. It's not just natural necessity, like the austerity hawks would tell you. It is a profoundly political project that has its own rationality, and it is very successful at it because it stabilizes class relations. And this is crucial, I think, to understand what is happening still today. So maybe briefly, I can just tell you the book is basically organized in two parts. The first part addresses a history that is rarely told. And again, I think we need to understand the responsibility, the intellectual and political responsibility of academics who pick and choose what they study. And because, of course, what you study has political consequences, either in preserving consensus or in trying to break away from certain conceptual traps that are then also material traps. Well, the first part of the book tells the story about what happened with the First World War, which is a fundamental existential crisis of our economy. And it's interesting because scholars of the interwar years never really focus on 1919, 1920. They usually focus on 1929, 1930, when the system was again reasserted, and you focus on the Great Depression, right? That's usually what you talk about if you think about the interwar years. Well, it's very interesting because if you look at the Great War, you find out how the Great War, a moment of unprecedented politicization of the economy, in the sense that the state had no option but to intervene drastically in regulating production and distribution and in disciplining workers to make sure that the production was fast and efficient enough to win the war. Well, this shock to the capitalist economy until that moment had a profound effect of opening up spaces for political imagination in ways that are truly fascinating. And the whole first part of the book is a reconstruction of all of the different experiments with post-capitalist societies that were emerging not in Eastern Europe, but in the heart of Western capitalism. The parallels between Italy and Britain, and how the call for worker self-management was extraordinarily popular, even in Britain. And this was so popular that even the British Parliament had to fundamentally come to terms with the fact that potentially the nationalization of coal, the main source of energy, and the self-management of coal mining from the part of workers was a possible better solution than what had happened until then. So they discuss it even in Parliament with the Sankey Committee, and they are actual realities opening up, even from the bureaucrats in power, not just from the radicalized working classes. So I draw a spectrum of different possibilities for economic reconstruction after the war, from the more radical to the less radical, but they all had in common the idea that the logic of profit was obsolete and was ultimately detrimental to the majority's interest. And so the example, just to mention one that I possibly prefer, is in chapter 4, I dedicate a whole study on the experiment of the occupation of factories in Italy in 1919, 1920, with Antonio Gramsci and his comrades leading the factory council movements in Turin. That spread like wildfire to the point that in the summer of 1920, the majority of factories in Italy were occupied and the majority of land was taken over by peasants. So a moment in which there was really a heavy questioning of the capital order and the two pillars, again, private command over investment and wage labor, that ground our economy today. So in all of this fervor, of course, the elite who had benefited from the system until then, it doesn't stay and watch, doesn't just like accept. It gets organized in a very, very efficient way. And what's interesting is that you find out how powerful austerity as a recipe to protect and to fundamentally rescue the crumbling capitalist system is. And so the second part of the book is all about how the austerity agenda is created and implemented throughout Europe. The focus is again on Britain and Italy. I'll tell you why in a second. But I do want to say that the book starts with the first international financial conferences, in which the austerity template is very clearly imagined. And what you see is that for the first time, economics professors are brought as the main advisors. Representatives of labor were not admitted at the conference. And the conference in this way represented itself in Brussels as a very scientific, objective worldview, because who was called was not the representatives of the political parts, but economists. So the story has as protagonists economists who participated in envisaging and then implementing what I call the austerity trinity. So what I would like to do in the next 10 minutes before I turn it over to you is one, potentially tell you a little bit about the austerity trinity, and two, tell you a little bit about the ideas backing these economic policies, and fundamentally then a conversation about the de-democratizing process that is intrinsic to the austerity logic and how it played out both in a liberal setting in Great Britain and in a fascist setting in Italy. So, briefly, again, I told you how we have to rethink the definition of austerity to make sense of what's happening today. Well, the way you rethink it is by looking at historical processes. And what you find out is that at these conferences, as well as in the chambers of the British Treasury and the committees of the Italian fascist government, a trinity of policies was very clearly envisaged. The first was what we can call fiscal austerity, which is the one we usually focus on when we think about austerity. And again, it has nothing to do with just cutting the budget and increasing taxes. It has all to do with cutting social expenditures, specifically. Housing, schools, education. I know there's plenty of cuts envisaged in Austria right now. I'm currently in the United States, in which Donald Trump is, of course, bringing the logical austerities to its extremes, menacing to close down the Department of Education, eliminating Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps. But this is, again, something you already saw in 1920, when the motto was consume less, produce more. The whole point was, how do we get a population that has spoken up and has acted to demand an alternative to ultimately behave in the way it should and accept their position as wage workers that consume little so as to leave the majority of the wealth produced to profitable investment, right? To actually what they called productive consumption. The unproductive consumption of the people had to be curtailed. So what you do is cut social expenditures and implement regressive taxation. So again, it's not about increasing taxes. Always talk about is increasing taxes. It's regressive taxation. This means that you are structurally increasing the taxes on workers. And after the First World War, what happened was that the British Chancellor of the Exchequer was bragging about how, as well as the economist under Mussolini, bragging about how they found more workers that were now taxable. So you enlarge the taxation basis, you have the poorest get taxed, you increase the consumption taxes, for example, on bread, on liquor, on cigarettes, which was very popular in that time, while you got rid of all of the progressive taxation that actually was implemented in 1919 because of the pressure of the workers. So this was about blocking super profit taxes, eliminating inheritance tax. Mussolini got a lot of applauses because he got rid of inheritance taxes and other taxes on profits. So this is, again, something that resonates with us. And it's important that this fiscal austerity was implemented in the moment in which the welfare state had actually just been born in Europe. Okay, the welfare state, as we know it, actually has its origins through the struggles during the First World War and after of the pressure from below. And it was fundamentally slashed in Britain with the Geddes Axe, in Italy through Mussolini's killing of... Is that my phone? Wait on. Good. It's probably my phone. Mussolini killing social expenditures and firing, for example, 75,000 public employees in one go. Okay, then we have monetary austerity. Monetary austerity works together with fiscal austerity in increasing the market dependence of the majority. Okay, so all of us, if we have our basic needs commodified, we now have to purchase them. And trust me, if you live in the United States, you see what that means. If you need to get cured, we know that the majority of Americans actually forego medical care because they can't afford it. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a lot of people are without teeth because they can't afford a dentist. So the foregoing of the giving up of these services means now you have to purchase them, which means that you are more vulnerable to having to accept a job for a wage in order to survive, all right? In the meantime, of course, you're incentivizing and subsidizing and protecting private investors. This is the same logic that applies to monetary austerity. Monetary austerity ultimately increases the vulnerability of workers by increasing unemployment, all right? If you actually increase interest rates, you have an effect that is of a downturn in the economy, which immediately might hit profits, but ultimately who it hits is the working class that once unemployed, of course, loses bargaining power. And this worked out really well in Britain. In 1920, the Bank of England increased interest rates by 7%. Just a year later, unemployment had skyrocketed to 17% of the unionized workforce, of the insured workforce. And strikes, participation and intensity had really diminished, so as well as union participation rates. So in chapter 9, I actually have all the historical data that shows how effective monetary austerity was in disciplining workers into accepting the wage relation. So you see how fiscal and monetary austerity are not technical things that happen outside of our existence, because they hit labor relations. And this is, again, not a chance. It's actually clearly understood as the proper effect austerity should have. And this is clear from the models of economists still today. Finally, there's the third element of the Trinity, which is industrial austerity. Industrial austerity comes in the form of privatizations, deregulation of the labor markets, and fundamental wage repression. And this was very strong with Mussolini, who, just like Hitler, kind of had a very hard hand on labor, eliminated unions, eliminated the right to strikes, crippled wages by decree. And this was, again, something that the liberal establishment was extremely happy about. So part of the story I tell here is how this austerity trinity was what allowed Mussolini to thrive as a political leader. Mussolini did not come to power through a coup. He was called by the king to resolve the political crisis that was developing in the country. And he did so by implementing very, very, very harsh austerity. And chapter 8 of the book really delves into how this helped Italy present itself as a good country in really accepting what was the recipe coming from Britain, the United States, and the global elite. So the fact that you have Montagu, now I don't have my book in English and I can't read this. But Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England, who is the emblem of liberalism, if you like, he wrote a letter to Jack Morgan Chase of Chase Bank, saying very clearly, almost literal words, Mussolini was the right man at the right moment. He was necessary in order for the pendulum not to swing too far in quite the opposite direction. And what the Bank of England, the Times, and the Treasury were showing is that how, of course, Mussolini meant much greater profits for foreign investors, and thus how ultimately the loss of political freedom was secondary to what for them was the economic freedom of the investor. So the story I tell here, again, is to actually compare two realities that seem very, very far apart. Liberal Britain, the cradle of parliamentary democracy, also the empire, this strong economy that was just then losing the hegemony because of the United States emerging as a global force. With respect to Italy, a backward country, a dependent country, and the birthplace of fascism. And what you find out is that the two stories of these two seemingly very, very distant socioeconomic scenarios and institutional and ideological scenarios are very closely related if you focus on austerity policies and economic policies. And so not only do the Brits implement austerity through fundamentally prioritizing independent central banks, which is another way to de-democratize the economy, right? They fought for the independence of the Bank of England in a moment in which central banks were actually thought of as potential nationalizable institutions. Ralph Hotchie, who's the protagonist of my book, said, you know what, central banks should never explain, never regret, never apologize. The only way in which you're able to implement monetary austerity is to keep people away from deciding, because of course they would not accept hard dosage of your money that screws their conditions as workers, right? So this de-democratization of the economy that happens in Britain through technocratic institutions that isolate themselves from political debate and deliberation, in Italy happened through the strong man and the regime of Benito Mussolini, who, had a harder line, but ultimately the goals of stabilizing the capital order were achieved in both countries. And so both countries actually unite, and it's not only just a parallel story, it's also about how the alliances between liberals and fascists are very strong when it comes to austerity. I conclude by just focusing a little on what is ultimately, I think, another contribution of this research, which is the role of economics as a discipline. So if any of you has studied economics, I'm sure you are just presented with a textbook and some principles, some axioms, and then some problems to solve. There's very little sense that actually economics is a field that is fraught by conflict of frameworks and epistemic conflicts. And that actually economics is all about battles of ideas and the dominance of one framework over all others. And the dominance of the neoclassical framework, which is something that clearly is everywhere today, has a very interesting history. And so what is, I think, fascinating about the 1919-1920 moment is that it was a moment in which also economic ideas were being disputed, of course, just as economic institutions were being disputed, so were economic ideas. And there was a clear sense by which economists organized to diffuse and strengthen what is the so-called pure economics. So we have the real diffusion of this paradigm shift from what was political economy in the Marx and Ricardian tradition that really focused on the labor theory of value. So again, the idea that ultimately value is derived from unpaid labor and that the worker is at the center of value production in a capitalist economy, to a framework that expels the worker from the scene fundamentally, to substitute the worker with the saver investor, and expels classes altogether to substitute the world with individuals who do not have conflict with one another, but are actually in harmony. And this fundamental paradigm shift is really crucial to disempower workers and to disempower us today in how we think about the economy. And what's interesting is that we take this for granted because we don't see how the assumptions were deeply political. But if you go and look at when it happened, especially with the economists, both in Italy and in Britain, really, you find out how classist this shift was and how political it was and how it was embedded in the struggle by which Maffeo Pantaleoni, and again, I'm sorry I didn't bring my book because I did want to read some quotes, but I forgot it. Maffeo Pantaleoni, for example, do you have it? Yes. I'll read you. I think it's better than if I just try to say it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I should know where things are. This is a new paperback edition, so it's not... okay, yes. Okay, so this is Alberto De Stefani. Alberto De Stefani was the finance minister of Benito Mussolini. So he's an economist, professor of economics in Venice. And in 23, he writes, I was seduced. So this is when De Stefani recounted his exhilaration on first discovering pure economics when he read Pantaleoni's Principles and Pareto's Cours d'Economie in a bookstore. So Maffeo Pantaleone and Vilfredo Pareto as like founding fathers of neoclassical economics. I was seduced by an analysis in which the useful and the harmful, the pleasure and the pain, and all the most complex facts of our economic order were conducted through calculus formulae and described through graphic representations. The equilibria became intersection points of curved systems and numbers that resolve systems of equations. The human spirit found quietude in those formal truths. So their whole depiction of economics, the socialist and the protectionist are to the economist, like the astrologist to the astronomer, the alchemist to the chemist, the sorcerer to the doctor. So this very big sense, of course, of the emergence of the objective, neutral science that is, in a way, pure of any political bias and thus should be understood for its authority, is very strong. But what is interesting is that if you pair it with what these same economists were writing on the newspapers, you realize how politically motivated this epistemic turn was, right? So the epistemic turn was ultimately a very powerful political tool. Claiming that economics was apolitical was a profoundly political move that had enormous success in convincing us that ultimately austerity were the only option and the only necessary option in this world. And it's interesting because while we take the end of the labor theory of value for granted and the success of what they ultimately called the theory of abstinence, the fact that actually, no, value does not come from labor. It comes from the virtuous capacity to save and invest of the entrepreneur, who then should be thanked for employing workers. And this is exactly what these guys are saying. So here we have Einaudi. Why should the capitalist profit only because the machine is his? Why shall he live without doing anything? Is it not obvious that his profit comes from the exploitation of someone else's labor? He asked sarcastically. This is a celebrated and vulgar sophism of Marx's Capital. But it's enough to ask, how much would be produced if the savers did not produce capital? The answer, nothing. Without capital, labor produces zero. So you see this very important passage of like agency from the worker to the saver investor that ultimately then motivates austerity policies that are nothing but the shifting of resources away from the workers to the savers investors. And it's fascinating because you see that actually in their newspaper articles, someone like Pantaleone, who's considered, the founding father of this objective science, is calling workers pigs. This is him. And I'm not making this up. Thanks to Bolshevism, the modesty and the standard of living that characterized Italians has vanished, has disappeared in both the working class and the peasantry. It's disgusting to witness the masses of workers that are drunk in all our cities. The notable increase of wages was not accompanied by greater civilization, so that the worker and his spouse lived like pigs in their homes in order to waste the greatest part of their income in wine at the tavern. So this sense by which workers cannot do anything productive, they can only squander, is something that, of course, we've internalized very deeply in how we perceive social hierarchies today. And, you had this version, but then you had the version of the British, which was very similar. They were saying, why is there inflation? Because workers are consuming too much and their wages are too high, which is exactly the type of economic models that still lead central banks today in deciding how to resolve the inflation crisis. So I think this part of the book is also an interesting, it is illuminating to actually kind of demystify the role of economists as neutral experts and actually show how part of this project is the de-democratization once more, because you need to keep those people who can't behave away from economic decisions because they will never be rational enough to actually support a well-working capitalist economy. I end by saying, unfortunately, these economists were not wrong. It's too easy to dismiss them as wrong. And this is where I think my analysis really differs from a Keynesian analysis. The point is, these economists are telling us the truth of how capitalism as an economic system actually best functions. Our capitalist economy does not function if investors lack expectations for profits. It cannot function if there's too much social redistribution in society, because social redistribution risks empowering workers to demand alternatives and greater participation in the production and distribution of resources. And this is incompatible with our capitalist economy. So the whole point here is not to say these guys were evil and austerity is bad. It's to say, let's understand that austerity is telling us really the truth of where we are at the moment. And we need to grapple with this reality if we want to have ideas of how to move forward. Last thing I'll say is that at the CHE, the Center for Heterodox Economics, we are trying to do something that ultimately I think is one out of the many attempts to break away from the ideological and the material traps that govern us. And the idea is to say that academics are very responsible for the current state of affairs because they participate in just being removed and enjoying writing books and just becoming famous and going to conferences and speaking to themselves. So I saw a lot of this, even in a non-suspected place like the New School, a lot of, ultimately Marxian economists who then did not want to participate, for example, in the fact that we had solidarity with our students when they were protesting against the university's support for the massacres in Gaza. And I think ultimately, this is why it is important to understand the role of thinkers and academics differently. And at the CHE, we're trying to really offer a space where we can learn from the social struggles and accelerate those movements that are already in action. And this is, I think, at the beginning, but it does offer a different way of understanding how knowledge is produced and what economists have to contribute in order to trying to offer a little bit of insights and potential for a different economic system. Our events are all on our YouTube channel. We have one a month. The next one is coming up on April 5th. It's on the housing crisis with scholars that have been both thinking about it theoretically, but also kind of practicing. For example, a couple of them actually been working with the Mexican government right now, who has pretty interesting social housing reform projects that are against the current. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the book and about the center. And now I turn it over to you, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation more about Austria. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clara, for this concise introduction to your book and in the many strengths of the book. When I read it, I had sort of three main takeaways. The first one was the importance of shifting the historic or the ideological lens and sort of what are the topics that we look at, what are the time frames that we look at. The second part was what you described, the trinity of austerity. And the third part was this whole idea of the depoliticization of the economic system and of economics as a inherently political act to, in the end, weaken working class actors, for example. I myself work as an economist at the Chamber of Labor, where we, I think, share a lot of the ideals that you just shared for the CHE. Where we want to do economic analysis always in conversation with trade unions, for example, with social struggles, which also gives me the very privileged position that I had time to sort of prepare also this talk tonight. And the comment I want to give now is sort of addressing these three takeaways that I took. First one is sort of the historic lens. And when I read your book, I was thinking to myself, how how was austerity introduced in Austria in the early 1920s? Because similar to what you described, if we think about the economic history of Austria, we sometimes think of the achievements of early socialist revolutionaries in 1918 to 1920, introducing the welfare state. We then have this dubious era of high inflation, sort of civil war, and we have Austrofascism, and then we move on. But it was really worth reading into what was happening back then as well, and how the aspects that you described for England and for Italy were then sort of implemented as a next step in a country like the Republic of Austria, which was not the empire of Austria-Hungary anymore, but more a peripheral country without an industrial base, and how working class ideas were sort of battled here. So just to briefly refocus us on Austria here, on the things that you've already mentioned, World War I in Austria meant that, for example, right on the day of the general mobilization in 1914, there was an imperial emergency decree that allowed, for example, the government to use the central bank's money printing press to finance the war, something that was sort of unthinkable. The years before that, the printing press would directly finance government expenditure. And in the end, the monarchy's war costs in Austria were financed around 40% through central bank loans and 60% through war bonds, which meant that profits, for example, of private companies increased manifold. Many of the companies that, as you mentioned, today profit from militarization also back then profited. But it was also an era of socialization of investment, we would call it nowadays, right? Where the state had a stronger role in planning. And one very famous socialist writer that is probably common to most here in the audience, Otto Neurath, for example, started in the Ministry of War Planning and developed his ideas of socialist planning when he witnessed how the war economy is planned in Austria-Hungary. I mean, he later famously moved on to the very short-lived Socialist Republic in Munich, and then moved back to Vienna, where he was more focused on education after sort of socialist revolutions were battled and not as successful as he hoped for. Then after World War I, we are faced in Austria with a situation where the remnants of the empire meant that what we called then the First Republic of Austria was a very small republic, not a lot of industrial base because that was in the Czech Republic, not a lot of agriculture because that was in other regions as well. A lot of, we would now call it service industry and bureaucracy in Vienna, but not a lot else. Some industrial bases, of course, in Lower Austria. And in the first years after 1918, a very strong socialist movement that fought for many things that are now the cornerstones of the Austrian welfare state, right? The introduction of the 8-hour workday, unemployment insurance, the strengthening of worker and tenant protection, paid vacation, sick leave. All of these are improvements that were first implemented in the first co-led government by the socialists. Incidentally, a government where in 1919 Joseph Schumpeter was Minister of Finance here in Austria. Very shortly, though. I mean, he was sort of the compromise candidate, and he didn't stay long. There was some disagreement because he wanted to privatize or sell certain industries to Fiat, to Italian private capital. But the Social Democrats were in government only for 2 years, wanted an increased wealth tax, didn't get it, eventually left the government in disagreement with the conservative and right-wing forces and sort of secluded them more to Vienna, where they, for the following years, which is now very famous as Red Vienna, sort of had the attempt to build socialism in one city, so to speak, right? They introduced very progressive taxation and finance systems. They built public housing here, which we still benefit from. The municipality of Vienna still owns 200,000 apartments in Vienna, keeping rents relatively low compared to other capital cities, but also huge improvements in education, etc. But on the federal level, there was huge budget deficits back then because a lack of industrial bases. I found out in my research, for example, which I was unaware of, that from 1918 to 1922, approximately 75% of the federal budget was through deficits. So we're not talking about 3-4% like we do now. It was 75%. And ultimately financed through the central bank. So the central bank financed this deficit directly. The Austrian crown, the currency back then, was in crisis, devalued. But
by the way, something that you cannot, the European Central Bank cannot do by mandate.
Yeah, not on the primary market. Yeah, I mean, we can maybe talk later a bit how we envision more democratic central banking, maybe how it could look differently. Austria experienced sort of a short period of almost full employment in 1922 because also of an influx of foreign capital because the currency was so devalued. So Austrian labor was so cheap in international comparison. But then in 1923, crumbled already. Unemployment of insured workers shot up to 8.5%. And the budgetary situation was discussed as being extremely dire. And here we have 2 or 3 ways that I found very interesting. The first way was, if you read the socialists' finance plan back then, it basically reads like a social democratic finance plan nowadays, right? And they called it themselves a financial plan, which is by no means the program of a socialist financial policy, but it contains only practical measures that could be implemented within the bourgeois social order, because they knew by 1922, revolutionary tendencies had toned down and they wanted to sort of present themselves as being taking serious in the debate and wanting to propose something that could be implemented, which included progressive wealth taxation, a land tax, some company taxation on industrial goods, which would also lead to increased prices for consumers, which they were aware. They sort of shared a similar ideal that Social Democrats have now in Austria, of the budgetary deficit being carried by broad shoulders, is the words we use now. They wanted real wages to increase, but also reduce food subsidies to sort of reduce the state's deficits there. And also, interestingly, back then already called for public investments in the electrification of certain industries, what we would probably now call social ecological investment ideas of, back then it was the electrification of the railways. Of course, that didn't happen. This purely reformist program didn't make it. Instead, the budgetary position grew so dire in the view of many that what followed were the negotiations with the League of Nations.
Yes.
Right? And that is where your talk and your chapter about the ideas that developed in Geneva and in Brussels sort of were fully implemented also for the first time in Austria. What the League of Nations did was not giving Austria money. All they did was guaranteeing Austrian bonds. So Austria still had to get the money internationally on financial markets, but the signatory powers of the League of Nations guaranteed the loans. They didn't guarantee them cheaply. They got the tariffs and tobacco monopoly as guarantees from Austria, for example, again, using tobacco here. They said that as a first protocol of the League of Nations guarantees that Austria shall not join Germany. Of course, an important point of discussion back then. They introduced a general commissioner from the League of Nations, having an office here, being paid by the Austrian government, with the goal of reducing the deficit in 2 years. So 2/3 of the budget is run by deficits. Reduce that in 2 years. That was the idea. That was the goal. And only he had control of the money account where the Austrian bond revenue came in. So if Austria didn't succeed, he didn't pay out money from the account, right? Part of the agreement was the introduction of a new central bank system. The Österreichische Nationalbank, as we now know today, was introduced as part of the Geneva Protocol as an independent central bank, not being allowed to buy Austrian bonds anymore. So there was a strict cutoff line where Austrian deficits were not allowed to be paid out by the central bank balance sheet anymore. And also part of the decree, officially a paragraph in the League of Nations treaty was, quote, the Austrian government will take all measures to maintain public order, right? So already what we now are more familiar with the Troika, for example, in Greece in the 2010s, all of that had already been established back then. The ideas of the reducing the deficits were tax increases on consumption taxes, the reduction of social spending, letting go of 1/3 of public employees. Over 80,000, Austria had around 6 million people back then, over 80,000 public employees were let go without plan, throughout every department with the same quota, similar to Elon Musk's ideas nowadays. There was an idea by the Austrian government to not completely drive down investment. So one idea they had, they would issue a bond that would finance water or electricity plants, but the League of Nations Commission denied it on the basis that the Czechoslovakian coal barons were against it, because that would, of course, diminish the import of cheap energy from the coal barons from the Czech Republic. Of course, this program, as we now know, didn't work. It led to high inflation. It led to extremely high levels of unemployment. But also here, make no mistake, Chancellor Seipel, back then the Chancellor, a Roman Catholic priest, very authoritarian figure of the 1920s, to quote him, wanted to use this deficit or to use this austerity program to, quote, clear away the revolutionary rubble of 1980 to 1920, so what we now call the social welfare state he wanted to abolish. I want to end here with the historic analysis. I mean, what followed, of course, that's what we're more familiar with, leading eventually to the Great Depression, more than 500,000 workers in Austria unemployed. And then eventually in 1933, when a second round of austerity was put into place, the railway union being the strongest one in Austria called out a general strike, or led a strike of railway union workers. The government crushed the strike, and this debate about how the government reacted was this infamous parliament session where the parliament then was eventually dissolved by then later dictator Dollfuss, who aligned with Mussolini and introduced Austrofascism, where we sort of have the first answer to the question that we posed for tonight: does austerity lead to fascism? In the historic example, we can see a lot of parallels to your case study of Italy and England, also in Austria. Now, moving back to the present, I thought it would be interesting to maybe give a short contextualization of the debates we have today in Austria and why this talk is so relevant for us in Austria right now. Austria does have a new government. Maybe I'll give you some framework here as well. I mean, this is maybe a bit boring for the audience, but so that you know what is happening in Austria right now. We had the far-right party coming in first in the election half a year ago with almost 30% of the votes. The longest phase of government formation since 1945 and 2 failed attempts. We now have a coalition of compromise, a so-called Austrian value that the Austrian president hailed as something that is achieved now with this new government of the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, and the Liberals, with numerous ideological gaps that they have to bridge. So this government program that we are now faced with today, I mean, at the Chamber of Labor, we evaluated it, has a lot of highlights in it, some stuff that we appreciate. You know, in the education sector, we have a kindergarten year that will come in Austria that will be financed. We have a few cool things happening in housing, in rent breaks, in the health sector, and at the same time, an extremely restrictive and legally dubious chapter on asylum, for example, right? Combining sort of the worst ideas of some of the parties. And if you read the government's proposal for what to do for the next 5 years, almost every second proposal comes with an asterisk. And the asterisk is subject to budgetary constraints. And the reason for that is because Austria is facing a double crisis right now. One is an economic crisis. It's the 3rd year of recession this year in Austria, marked by a decline in investment. And as you pointed out, as long as we are in a capitalist economy, private investment and public investment drive growth and drive the economy. We have very cautious private consumption, a weak global demand for Austrian industrial goods. But even there, we sometimes like to contextualize at the Chamber of Labor that Austrian industry is not as bad as the captains of industry always want to tell us. What Austrian industrial workers produce is enormous. If we look at industrial production in Austria, even this year, it's 15% above 2015 levels, even after 3 years of recession. Compare that with Germany's industrial production, which is 10% below the 2015 levels. But we have an unemployment rate of 8.6% of insured workers. We have 5 unemployed workers for every 1 job vacancy. So clearly we have a labor market that is under duress. And the second crisis is, and this is where this book is so timely, I think, a budgetary crisis. The new European economic framework, the European fiscal framework, is in effect again. The previous government of Austria made a lot of tax cuts, very generous tax cuts, mainly to companies, right? The corporate tax was reduced from 25, already quite low, to 23%. Family policies that were introduced function very regressive. Familienbonus Plus, some might be familiar with in this room, is not usable for low-income households if they don't pay income taxation, which they could deduct it from. And in this setting, the new fiscal rules put in place told Austria, so to speak, or the European Commission's calculations told Austria needs to saved this year over 6 billion euros, right? Around 1.3% of GDP at a times of recession. Now, the far right have the second go at the government, sent a letter to Brussels listing the ideas of how they would get the 6 billion euros. And when they failed and time was of essence, the newly formed government took over these 6 billions, changed it a bit, made it a tiny bit more progressive with more contributions from the banking sector, but zero additional revenues were included, for example, from increased wealth taxation, right? So that's what I meant with ideas that the Social Democrats put forward now mirror sort of what the Socialist Party did 100 years ago. And like 100 years ago, they're not implemented. The progressive wealth taxation or the reintroduction of an inheritance tax is nowhere to be seen. But this the talk about the 6 billion deficit and the talk about the 18 to 23 billion euros that Austria needs to sort of cut from its budget is discussed in a way in the Austrian public as if it is a law of nature, as if it is a technocratic assignment that needs to be solved, right? There's very little debate in the public in Austria that is the result of a depolitization process of the economy. With Austria joining the Eurozone, with the European Central Bank practicing certain things that also led to maybe more flexible forms of dealing with economic crisis, where Austria has a rich heritage of what we call Austro-Keynesianism in the 1970s, very much influenced by post-Keynesian thought, where a lot of good things happened back then that are now not possible today. I want to end with two things here. One is to take a short look at the power blocks involved in Austria, and the second look at the austerity trinity that you laid out. The first one about the power blocks is who are the social actors today dealing with this double crisis? I mean, we could also expand it to a triple crisis with the ecological crisis as well, which is also not very well addressed in the new government platform. If we look at the power blocks, we have the Chamber of Labor, the Austrian Trade Union Federation, which is a unitary union, which still relies on a lot of successes it hasn't had in the past and still produces a lot of successes in the collective bargaining arena. I mean, Austrian workers have a collective bargaining coverage of almost 100%. Real wages in Austria are higher than 5 years ago compared to other European countries. So that's not sort of the biggest issue right now, but still struggling with high unemployment and low and declining union density. So more radical ideas can be put in place if you don't have union organization locally. And at the same time with the new government, including the Social Democrats and trade unions being a part of that, you are now part of the government. You want to make a budget deficit program as socially just as possible, but accepting the deficit program as is in terms of the values that need to be generated. If we look at a capital faction in Austria, what was very interesting in the past weeks, and I think that could also be the potential breaking point of this government in the following years, we for the first time saw out in the public a split in the capital factions. We had the Federation of Austrian Industries, a voluntary association dominated by big business and export businesses, clearly expressing a preference for the far right, hoping that with them they could weaken the trade union movement, that they could take back the real wage increases of the previous years. A very clear preference that they also stated in the media after the talks broke down, that it's a pity that those talks broke down. And at the same time, other entrepreneurs more in medium-sized companies who were a bit at unease with the far right and their stance on the European Union because they knew how important the European Union market is for their companies, but also representatives of the Austrian Economic Chamber, which is part of the social partnership with mandatory membership, which was also unsure where to go. But ultimately, this later faction prevailed, but we'll see in the upcoming years if the first faction can use certain breakpoints in adjusting the deficit as a maybe call for snap re-elections. I want to end with the Trinity of Austerity, because I thought it, for me at least, was a very interesting thought experiment to think through the three aspects of your Trinity and how we face them today in the Austrian economy. In terms of fiscal austerity, I already laid out how the European fiscal rules are used at the moment, that the proposed austerity measures of course, include measurements that are socially unjust. We scrapped, or the Austrian government will scrap the so-called climate bonus, which is a redistribution mechanism from the CO2 taxation. There will be higher healthcare contributions by pensioners, which is somewhat cushioned by price caps on medicine. So that's where sort of the cushioning comes a bit in. But significant budget cuts across ministries that we will face in the upcoming weeks, and we'll see, so to speak, how much it will hurt. But it will hurt. That's sort of the message we get right now. If we look at monetary austerity, Austria is part of the Eurozone, right? The Austrian Central Bank's governor, who is a member of the ECB, not directorate, but the executive committee, is a hardcore monetarist. He was nominated by the Freedom Party in the last legislative, or in the previous to last legislative period, who was always in favor of interest rate hikes and defended them all the way through, even though we had all the analysis that the inflationary period in Austria was not caused by demand pull inflation, right? We know all of that stories. With the hike in interest rates came huge profit in the Austrian banking sector.
Of course.
30 billion euros in the past 3 years accumulated. 30 billion euros. The Austrian GDP is around 500 billion. 30 billion euros in private bank profits. A recession in the construction and industry sector fueled by the interest rate hikes, increased unemployment. And now, of course, the other side of the balance sheet of the central bank, if you pay out all the money to private banks, also means a loss for the central bank, which also means no central bank profits sort of going into the public budget either. And then the final task was looking at industrial austerity, which I must admit I had a bit of a harder time, because also I'm a bit biased as a Chamber of Labor economist, and I still do see a lot of achievements that we've had in the past years, that workers' councils fought for a good real wage increases in the end now. But what we do see is a coordinated attack by the Federation of Austrian Industries against collective bargaining agreements. A coordinated attacks right now to not increase wages anymore. Just to give one anecdote, I talked with workers' councilsmen from the paper industry. We have around 20 paper mills in Austria who produce all kinds of things. And like many sectors in the Austrian economy, the paper mills are very diverse. Some of them have high profits, some of them have low profits. Some of them, which I just learned, we are, I guess, market leader in papers for cigarette tips. Those are produced in Austria. I didn't know that previously. So our average that we know from Chamber of Labor analysis is around 80% of industrial companies make a profit, 20% don't make a profit. That's how it goes in competition, under competition in capitalism. It's not always the same companies that make a loss. And the same is true now. Even in an industrial recession, 4/5 or 2/3 of the companies still make profits. Nevertheless, in every single one of these 20 paper mills, the CEOs of those companies called for the workers' councilmen for a meeting, and in every single mill they told them there will be no wage increases this year, right? Of course, this is, drumming up, and there will be wage increases. If any one of you knows a worker in the paper industries, of course, there will be wage increases in some degree that will be fought for, but just the sheer coordinating right now shows you that Austrian industry or private capital looks at the past few years, thinks, oh, labor was quite successful in managing the crisis. We'll teach them a lesson now, right? Where it's easier for me to comment on is we have a lot of areas in the Austrian economy that are not unionized, or that are not even under official wage relations. They are under wage relations, but they are exploited self-employed workers, right? We have the care sector in Austria that is exploited in that way. And we just got the news last week that the riders that bring food stuff, we had 2 big companies in Austria providing the service. One company used collective bargaining agreements, which they now canceled and said, we will kick out the 600 riders. They will now be self-employed without coverage if they're sick, without coverage if they want to go on holiday, under a cost argument that they put forward. They need to make profits. The other company doesn't use collective bargaining agreements. Therefore, we don't do that. So in the service sector, we now see the service sector being the largest sector of the economy, that some of the vanguard of capitalist exploitation and how to use industrial austerity now is more in the service sector. I think I'll leave it with that. be happy for you maybe to add some comments if you want to, but then later on also open it to the public. Maybe finish off with a question to you with coming back to the present. We know how austerity works. Before we open the round of Q&A, what to do? How could a different mode of economic governance or how to face austerity at the moment look like in countries like Austria, Italy, the US?
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I think one point that emerges, and again is a point that is completely under discussed in the debates, is how we're not all in the same boat, right? Sacrifice is not diffused equally. Again, when your money is sacrificed for workers, it actually, for those who can lend money, is extremely profitable. Money creates more money that way at even faster rate. But oh my goodness, I'm so out of it. I needed to say something I forgot. Yes. No, I wanted to say something else. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm so tired that my brain is just like.
If you prefer, we can also open the discussion for Q&A, and then maybe it comes back to you.
Yes, I don't think it's gonna come back now. So yes, let's do that. Sorry. Yeah, I guess so. Let's just do that.
All right. Maybe we'll come organically anyways, the points that you wanted to raise. I mean,
I needed to say
more time now.
it was also a good point, but I forgot.